Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the magical place that is 6018 North. And a big thank you to Tricia Van Eck for hosting us tonight. I'm Axel Moller, cultural attaché at the French Consulate and director of the Villa Albertine in Chicago. So for those who don't know us yet, Villa Albertine is, among other things, a vast research residency program designed to strengthen ties between France and the United States. So Jennifer Buyck is one of our former residents in Chicago. She is an architect with a doctorate in aesthetics and also teaches urban planning at Université Gustave Eiffel in Paris. In April 22, Jennifer spent a month in Chicago walking and biking along rivers in all directions and everywhere. And you probably don't remember, but it rained almost constantly. So the experience was exciting but grueling, and I have to say that her tenacity and endurance totally impressed us. The project was a continuation of her previous work in the Mississippi Delta, and her intention was, I quote, to explore the environmental history of Chicago, to discover the Windy City's relation to its land, seeking to draw fresh attention to the biological world and the urban world. It was then that she met Tricia Van Eck, and the idea of an exhibition devoted entirely to water gradually took shape. The exhibition, Water, will occupy the entire building and will be inaugurated this Sunday. We hope to see you there. Jennifer has made 2 films as a result of her 2 exploratory trips, and this is where they will be shown for the very first time, but you can already have a look at both of them in the 2 spaces on the first floor. But tonight we're kicking off the festivities with a fascinating conversation entitled Chicago River at the Scale of the Anthropocene, moderated by Jennifer. I'd like to warmly Adam Flickinger, Ron Henderson, and Phil Nicodemus for agreeing to take part in this conversation, which is the very first of a long series of events we're organizing this fall with various partners as part of the 5th Chicago Architecture Biennial. And you can see the Villa Albertine website for details, dates, locations, and contents. And now I'll give the floor to our speakers. Thank you.
So thank you, Axel, and hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you here in this room, in this beautiful building for this exhibition. So as Axel already told, this exhibition will open on Sunday, and it's part of the Chicago Biennial. It's a result of a collaboration between Tricia Van Eck, and I know she's nearby, the Villa Albertine, and I. So thank you very much for that. And I would also like to take the opportunity to pay a tribute to Tricia. So Tricia, I hope you are nearby. Because the work of Tricia is really wonderful. And without Tricia, this exhibition would not have been possible. Tricia, I don't know where you are, but you did an extraordinary job. Thank you. I'm very grateful. So thank you. This important fact has been being said. Some few words about me in order to introduce the debate. So I am architect by background. So as you all know, I'm French because of my accent, and I am professor in town planning in Paris in Université Gustave Eiffel. So I was resident of the Villa Albertine in 2022, and during my residency here, I spent a month walking along the rivers. As a result, you have okay. One film behind us. Normally it's with sound, for sure, but tonight, for this evening together, for this debate, it's a silent movie. And few years before, I explore, or I had the chance to investigate the Mississippi Delta. and the relation between the inhabitants and the communities with their land, their land is disappearing. And as a result of my research there is another movie in the room just next door. So if you are in this part of the room, you have the possibility to see both at the same time. And to see the movie with the sound, so feel free to come back Sunday or later. So why these two regions? Because Chicago metropolis and its rivers, as well as the Mississippi Delta, are paradigmatic places in the relationship between cities and environment. The question of artificialization of natural resources is posed with intensity, as are those of unpredictability, the evolution of living organisms, and of irreversibility. Even in French, that's hard. So, irreversibility, the disappearance of living organisms. But it's also because, despite being more than 900 miles apart, these two places are connected and belong to the same hydrographic bassin. Chicago is artificially one of the sources of the Mississippi, and obviously the Mississippi Delta is the mouth of this same river. So talking about the Chicago River at that scale, in this context, is for me a way to grasp what we call the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is the new geological area in which we are since the industrial turn. And I'm very pleased to speak about that today. We are our three panelists, our three guests. So I am with Ron Henderson, Phil Nicodemus, I'm sorry about that, and Adam Flickinger. So I have some questions for you all, and at the end of this first conversation, it will be time also to ask your own question for sure. So my first question will be for Ron Henderson. So Ron Henderson, you are professor in landscape architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology. So thank you, all of you, for being here for sure. So my question for you, Ron, is in relation with the historical and environmental context of the rivers of Chicago. So do you know what did rivers look like before their reversal? In other words, could you tell us what is their natural ecosystem?
First, thank you, Jennifer, and everyone who's brought me into the circle of the Villa Albertine. It's been a very rewarding and fruitful and productive collaboration. So I teach a course that I call the Natural History of Cities to graduate students at IIT. And I do that because so much of the work that planners, architects, and myself as a landscape architect are engaged in our generations is trying to reconnect, restore, revitalize ecosystems or natural systems, be they bird migrations or water flows, that have been disconnected during modernity. And so when we arrive at a meeting in City Hall about the future of a part of our city, I want everybody to actually understand the soil, that the loop is on 60 to 80 feet of layered clay soil. I want everyone to understand that the only place in the continent where the Great Prairie met the Great Lakes was essentially between what is now Hyde Park and the South Branch of the Chicago River. Everywhere else, there were savannas or sand dunes or other conditions that mediated between the prairie actually meeting the lake. So it's kind of a remarkable thing when you look at the natural history, not just the cultural history, in part because so much of the work that we're trying to do now demands that we make and reconnect these systems. So there are others who have studied and are probably much more authoritative. I'm not an ecologist, I'm a designer in the end, about those natural histories of the Chicago River. But I can say a few things. The Chicago River oozes more than it flows. It kind of just comes out of a soggy wetland south and west of the city in part, or north and west of the city. And it doesn't have a lot of hydrostatic pressure. It's not the Seine for sure. It's not the Loire for sure. And it's not very big and not very long. So it's characteristic as, the Great River of Chicago is kind of remarkable given its modesty, right? It's like one of the most modest rivers of all the great cities of the world. But it also has distinct characteristics that I think, my colleagues here on the panel are working very hard to give a voice to again. And it's great that people like Jennifer are bringing visualization and critical commentary and voices to look at it. It actually has many ecosystems, right? The North Branch comes out of glacial moraines with diverse hardwood forests. Diverse in Chicago means there are like 6 species. The South Branch, much less diverse, maybe 2 or 3 cottonwoods, maybe a few maples along the branches, along the banks, sedges and forbs. Because it was a fairly, also wasn't a kind of violent river. Turtles and amphibians, and it was a pretty fecund but simple landscape. As it met Lake Michigan, it was so kind of slow that the forces of the lake, with wind scouring the western shore, bringing material from Wisconsin, Minnesota down and scouring along the shore, that there was a sand spit that could close the river or almost close the river. And so as the river came to Lake Michigan, it took a turn south because it wasn't strong enough to overcome the forces of the lake. The lake would win. I think we all know that if you haven't been and you want to kind of get a sense of that natural native condition of the Chicago River, you go to Illinois Beach State Park and you see the dry river, which is a smaller version of a very similar landscape that would have historically been the Chicago River. So the next field trip is to Illinois Beach State Park. Who's been to Illinois Beach State Park? So you all know what we're talking about. And so the natural history of the river, it's kind of so easy to overwhelm it with pollution or industry or dredging, because itself or reversal, itself is such a modest body that it got overcome.
So thank you for that, Ron. Thank you very much. So it's really nice to discover by your words this landscape. That it's like a poesy to my point of view, and it's quite so. When I made this movie, the first time I showed to people, to Chicagoans, I was really afraid because I thought that everybody knew the river, but it was not the case. It was not the case at all. My second question will be for you, Phil. Phil Nicodemus, you are director of research at Urban Rivers, and so you are also involved in a specific project called 1 Mile, and I think everybody know what is 1 Mile. If not, you have to go there, sure. Ron explained us what the ecosystem look like, and so it's not a surprise to say that it's not exactly the case today. So that's why your organization is working towards ecological restoration. So you are trying to transform city rivers into urban sanctuaries. So my questions are quite simple. So what is exactly ecological restoration? What does it mean and how it works?
Yeah, thank you. And I took 4 years of French in high school that took me about 4 days to forget, so don't worry. So the focus of our organization and really the understanding that we've come to is, most cities in the country throughout the world have been founded on rivers. And historically, they've all done the same thing to these rivers. They relied on rivers for commercial usage, for clean water, for disposing of sewage and things like this. The consequences are that even though every city and every river is different in its own way and has its own unique character, ultimately the things that they have been subjected to are relatively similar. So we're talking about dredging of the bottom of these waterways, so removing the natural bottom and replacing it with something that was easier for shipping to move up and down and more reliable. Taking away the edges of the river and putting in artificial seawalls that would secure that shoreline and make it easier to move goods and ensure that the buildings that you're building are not going to fall in over time. There's this consistent pollution. And when a lot of people think of water pollution, you think of things dumping, and that's certainly a problem. But everything that our cars emit, all this emissions, they stick to walls and they stick to leaves, and it washes off in the rain and becomes water pollution eventually. So there's these persistent chronic issues that urbanized waterways have to deal with. And we need to understand that there's a lot of situations where you're not going to be able to make it as natural as you would like it to be. We have a great strip of river going from about Lake County to about the city limits, where this land was protected incidentally because it was handed over as a result of negotiating Native American treaties, extricating Native Americans from the land and keeping development off it for a century, basically. This allowed this very wide green strip to exist along both sides of the river. And there, in these upper reaches, you can really see what this river is supposed to look like. Illinois Beach State Park, a great example. But there's space. These rivers are living, breathing things. They wiggle along the landscape. They meander. Floods happen, which control a lot of populations and help a lot of things. Fires should come right up to the edges and things like that. So these landscapes are supposed to be big, wild places that have a lot of room to move. Through cities, we narrow that down and we confine it. So the questions that we have are, how can we correct these problems while accepting that this urban environment confines us and it has to be that way? There's also kind of a lot of environmental justice issues that go into this. Throughout the cityscape, a lot of areas that have been historically industrial and very polluted are also the areas that are getting redeveloped right now. So these are miles and miles of river frontage that, if the status quo is allowed to continue, we're just going to continue to be hard seawalls. It's not going to be ecologically vibrant like it could be. And interestingly enough, on all these places where industry survived, they turned away from the river. They allowed these trees, cottonwoods and box elders and things like that to exist. And the river was set apart so much from the urban environment that a lot of things found their way to surviving. And so this is what we do, is try to focus on making the best out of a bad situation. And our main way of doing this at this current time is building the Wild Mile. Like we said, it's a mile-long old industrial canal that is no longer used. It's very shallow. It's sedimented up over time. There's no plan to use it in the future. So instead of just letting this sit there, dominated by concrete on the edges, forgotten about, people are kept away from, what if we start to embrace these pieces of the river and really do what they're supposed to do, their primary function, which is allow wildlife to move up and down. And that wildlife passage through provides a really unique opportunity for people to connect with nature in a way that they don't really get to. And we think about this in terms of, there are folks who live 2 blocks away from our project who have been in the area for decades, who have seen this area transform from industrial and dirty to this new situation where people are moving in and factories are replaced with commercial stores and Lululemon stores and things like this. And it's in this context that people's perception of the river is so overwhelmingly negative. They are surprised that things are alive in it. They are shocked that they don't need to go rush to the hospital if they fall in. All these things that come from being so separated. So our goal in building the Wild Mile is to not only build artificial habitat structures like floating gardens. We have mussel bunkers that host freshwater mussels that should be plentiful throughout the river. We do a lot of different things that invite nature back into the environment, but then also invite those people to come connect with it. So it's as much about community building around the river as it is attempting in our own small and meek way to reverse this larger trend of removing plants and removing animals and allow that movement back through. So it's in a lot of ways multifaceted, and our biggest frustration with stuff in a lot of time. People put a lot of work into a national park, and that's the strongest place, the best, most effective place to put your money. But if people can't get to a national park, then there's an issue there. If what people can get to is something much closer, then we need to bring that much closer to their homes, or else you've got, in Chicago, 2 million people that are never going to have that opportunity that everyone should be able to have. So for us, it's about inviting nature back into the city and then inviting people to start to explore that nature in a way that they've not been able to before.
So thank you very, very much, Phil. So Axel said in our introduction that it was that my film was the result of a kind of difficult jobs, that is to say, to walk along the river. But I have to say that my job is really easiest than yours. So thank you for that. And you helped me also for the transition for my last question, my next question to Adam. So Adam Flickinger, you are planning director of Friends of the River, the Chicago River. And my question is in relation with the community, so the inhabitants in their relation to the ecological restoration. So My question is, can we, and if how, restore the entire river ecosystem, and what role can local residents play?
All right. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for including me in this discussion. I think it's super interesting. I also have a design background, so I love when planners and designers bring up and elevate issues around the river. I think it's fascinating to think about. And in response to your question, it is literally my job to say absolutely yes. We believe that the entire river system has an incredible potential to be restored. And I think building off of what Phil was talking about, you know, one of Friends of the Chicago River's roles as an advocate for the river is to push against that lingering perception of the Chicago River as dirty and neglected, which still happens with especially people who have lived in Chicago for a very long time. But through Friends history, which started in 1979 with the publishing of an article in the Chicago magazine called Our Friendless River, and it was published by a planner, urban planner at the time, and he talked about the incredible missed potential of the river to be the center of Chicago and to be an alive place full of recreational use. And people at the time got very excited about that idea, and that's how we were founded. And from that time, we have witnessed through we do a lot of policy work at many levels, at the state level down to local government, working on water quality issues, working on land protection and watershed planning issues. And we've seen through all that work an incredible transformation, particularly after 2015 when the effluent plants started disinfecting the water that went into the river. That was a huge leap forward. And at the same time, the Tunnel and Reservoir project, which is underground infrastructure that holds wastewater before it enters the river, allowing it to be in large storm events filtered. The water quality increased exponentially, and since that time we've seen the Riverwalk, and we've seen vision plans, we've seen river edge trails and development, and an incredible growth of recreational use. I remember this was quite some time ago before I worked at Friends, but I was a volunteer, and one of the first meetings I went to was about the Chicago Riverwalk, and it was a very initial concepts, and the group of planners and designers who were discussing that work were kind of chuckling about the boat docking space, because they were like, do you think we're really going to need all that space for boats? Do you think there will be ever that much boat traffic to require that? And it's completely gone beyond what anybody ever imagined. So I think it's really exciting to see that transformation, but it's not to say that there aren't still challenges, especially now. We're starting to see with climate change, especially this summer, we're starting to see these increased, very damaging storm events, high flash flood problems, and all of that water is coming from the land around it. And like Phil explained, everything that leads to a lot of water pollution and water quality challenges. It floods communities. It causes destruction in habitat. So that's very concerning to us because there's so many years of investment that climate change is starting to put some of that at risk. So some of the things that we're working on, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of our the 3 example focus areas that we're trying to advance right now. The first one is, I think, kind of connects to what Phil was talking about, industrial use, but we feel very strongly that the zoning and the land use context, all of the laws that regulate development along the river were created during a different time. They didn't predict, and they haven't recognized that transformation that I just talked about. So there's a real opportunity to, instead of at the point we're at right now, which is quite reactive at the city to developers' proposals, to get ahead of that with really innovative and forward-thinking regulations that would start to shape the further transformation of the edges of the river. So we would love to see a land use plan and updates to our zoning code that would start to outline what the community wants and what river advocates want to see as a further transformation of those river edges. The city does have a very powerful, that Friends was a leader in creating in the 1990s, which is the Chicago River Ordinance, which requires a 30-foot setback. And in 2019, the design guidelines that go with the ordinance talk about everything you need to do in that setback. But I think the extent of the transformation and the extent of the people who want to use the river, we need more, and Friends always wants more. That's our personality. We always want to push the boundaries of what can be done. So I think thinking about the whole site and the whole corridor is really exciting, and we need the regulations to do that. So working at a different scale that we like to think about, and so Friends of the Chicago River works across the entire river system, and I do think it's important. It's kind of interesting to think about how you describe the history of the river and then the perspective of the downtown river, which is what many Chicagoans picture in their head, the very channelized, man-manipulated parts of the river, but it's part of a broader system that covers 156 miles of waterways all the way up into Lake County, Illinois, almost to the Wisconsin border, and down into Indiana with the Little Calumet River. And there's I'm a map person, so I wish I had a map, but there's, miles and miles of these little tributary streams and creeks that are in the southwest suburbs that we do a lot of our projects in large-scale landscape restoration work in forest preserves and along riverbanks down there. But all of those areas is where some of the richest and most well-protected and well-managed habitats are. But it's all part of the same system. So the fish and mussels and other, beavers and all the things that live in the river also come downtown. And it's part of this bigger watershed, really. And so we think about the entire watershed, and we've done that for years. And one of the areas that we've done a lot of work is up in the headwaters of the river system, which is in Lake County. There's three north branches of the river that stretch up there. And in the 1990s, we established a sub-watershed group that it's called the North Branch Watershed Work Group in Lake County that does projects, ecological restoration. They do stormwater catchment projects where they reconnect floodplains. And that was very successful. So one of the things we're working on now is trying to replicate that type of work across the entire regional watershed, which is about 1,000 square miles. And so we've just recently founded something in 2020 called the Greater Chicago Watershed Alliance, which is the goal of that is to get agencies to start to work together on larger resiliency and water issues. And we're very excited about that work. And really the goal is to bring additional money to our region from the new federal programs to invest in the areas of the watershed that really need the most investment. And right now we're very focused on the Calumet River area and the Little Calumet River, which has a great need for investment. And all of those projects, I think, one of the great opportunities of the river is because, unlike the lakefront, it reaches into the cities and into the suburbs that really need investment, and it has that opportunity to provide recreational space and trails and access to nature for all the people that need it across the region. So that's what we're very excited about and focused on.
So thank you very much, Adam, for all of that. And also for the transition for my last question, because it was a question about regarding the potential of the river. I think you were talking about that in your last sentence. So it's a question for the three of you, in fact. So, and it's the final question, okay? But I know you have some. So in the context of climate change, in the context of the Anthropocene, what role could rivers play in the Chicago's environmental transformation? Who's first?
So the way that we really think about a lot of our work really has to lean into the idea that climactically we're heading for a situation where things are going to be a lot more volatile and things are going to be a lot harder to predict, and the highs are going to be higher and the lows are going to be lower. And so strategies that deal with this are going to inherently, there's a lot of ways to ruin really good work along a river by not anticipating that what were once 500-year floods are now becoming 100-year floods and things like that. So we kind of have an opportunity, because we're in such a situation where we have to rebuild from the bottom up. We're an opportunity to try things out and figure out what really works and if this can be done sustainably and repeatably, understanding that there's going to be limitations to what you can do. So the way we look at it, this kind of stuff, getting this close to people, encourages them to think more about that. If you've never thought about the environment or the river before, when you come down and you see a bald eagle or you see some symbol that means something to you, all of a sudden you kind of have this more reason whenever you take a trip in your car or use a plastic bottle or something like this, you think more about it, and then maybe you start to vote more in a way that has these larger impacts. So I think in a lot of cases, the bottom gets forgotten. The grassroots things get forgotten and dismissed as being ineffective, but these are oftentimes the things that are done by most people. So if we're in this situation where you have to do things from the ground up in order to start pushing, and it seems like some way we don't get any help from the top down, or if it happens infrequently, you got to start pushing. You've got to start doing something. And so this is really, I think, a great way that a city and urban environment can say that we're not just going to use that. We're not going to let industry do this. We're going to start pushing back. We're just going to start embracing nature. And through that, people can become better advocates for the environment in general.
I think that I kind of wonder what would happen if we spent the money that was spent on the tunnel and reservoir project simply on remaking the surface of the entire city. Because the solution for the tunnel and reservoir project is engineerable. Soil percolation, reshaping roads, finding ways that water can be slowed down on its way to the river, could have been a different answer, and it could have transformed the city. That decision wasn't made, but I think that that's one of the ways that we're left with in order to kind of think about how we redesign the city project by project, or maybe infrastructure project by infrastructure project. Just last month, a team that I'm on received a National Science Foundation grant for $750,000 over 3 years, working to explore inequities of access to water infrastructure in Chicago. The project is led by a political scientist. So the water is political. It's also hyper-local. So, the people that are impacted by water quality are your neighbor. The people that are impacted by water quantity may very well be your neighbor. It could be yourself. As I said, Chicago is largely on a several dozens or tens of feet of clay. Clay doesn't allow water to absorb. So these events don't really have any place to go when they percolate only so far. And so the consequences are, I think we have to think about how we're designing projects, making policy, expanding the 30-foot around the river so the river can actually act like a river. I think that's really the work that's going to have to be done. And we really have to work to make sure that the people who have been affected or disenfranchised by either inequalities of water access, inequalities of water infrastructure, or being the downstream receptors of bad policies over the last 100 years. So yeah, we need politicians, designers, scientists, social scientists, all working on this.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's an all hands on deck situation. And I think it's also that watershed wide thinking, because we just finished a project called the Natural Solutions Tool, which is a geographic map that kind of ties together different aspects of planning. So it brings the ecological perspective together with human health disparities and pollution and air quality and other things, and shows that overlap and the way that natural systems can be applied to help improve the resiliency and the public health and also protect biodiversity in our watershed. So we're kind of using that as a template for how, talking a lot about how do we better invest in these areas strategically to do all those things at the same time, because those are the challenges we face. We're facing basically an ecological collapse. And I do sometimes get the question, I think, why, and probably you get this question too, is why do we invest in urban habitat? And I think one thing that I read a lot about that I find interesting is that cities are located in very strategic places for the same reasons for ecology as they are for people. So where you think cities are located where the rivers meet lakes and where lakes meet oceans and things like that, and Chicago is the same. And so it's a critical location for investing in habitat for migrating species as well as local species to help us, protect those populations. And so we're thinking about all sorts of strategies about connecting habitat corridors, and also at the same time having trails and connecting those for people as well. They can serve the same surface purpose as well as increasing resiliency by capturing stormwater all at the same time. So those are the types of strategies I think we need, and that requires, through our Watershed Alliance initiative, it requires transportation agencies to work with the people who work on habitat. And that's quite unique. Other regions have been doing that, but ours is a little bit behind with that coordination. And interestingly, there's great amounts of federal funding around resiliency, and they require that collaboration. So that's something we're trying to foster here so that we can capture some of that funding for our region.
So thank you very much. So a lot to do, and I think you have a lot of questions too. Okay. Yeah, first question.
I don't want to knock your glass. Okay, great. Hi, thank you so much. I'm Anna. So I have a question, or I sort of have two questions, but they're connected, and you can feel free to answer any part. I guess one is particular to Jennifer. I grew up on the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities, and I've been to the headwaters in northern Minnesota, and I guess I'm curious. Obviously, it's a significant river in the world and in this country. I'm really curious, and this could also just be a one-on-one conversation, depending on how you want to answer it. But I'm curious about why you began conducting research there, what parts of the river you have explored. I'm particularly obviously curious about if you've spent time in Minnesota and what you've learned. So that's sort of just one maybe personal curiosity. But then a more broad question that has led me to, that I think is I would like to offer to everyone in this panel, is I'm thinking about in Minnesota, where I grew up, there's such a strong a present vocal indigenous presence in regarding issues around the environment, and some of that is because the city of Minneapolis has like a huge Ojibwe and Dakota population in a way that is unique as far as a lot of larger cities in the Midwest go. So I'm curious about, and I feel like that really informs a lot of the ways that people there are thinking about ecological work, environmental work, protection. I'm moving here to Chicago. I feel like there's a tone of perhaps like invisibility, or not to say that there are not Indigenous people present in the city. That's very real, but I feel like the tone of the way that Indigenous voices are being given a platform in a particular way in movements, particularly around environmental justice in Minnesota, feels different than how I'm observing it here in Chicago. So I'm super curious if in the work you're doing, there are ways in which you're focusing on Indigenous perspectives and bringing those in to ecological work. I'm thinking a lot about many calls in the present day for like centering, bringing in Indigenous leaders to be the primary leaders and voices on these kind of issues. So yeah, that's kind of my twofold question.
Okay, thank you for that. Perhaps I will start first with the first question. So I have to say that I've never been to Minnesota. I have a lot to discover and to learn. So perhaps later I will get the chance to go there. So I have nothing to say about Minnesota. Okay. So my first survey in the US was in the Mississippi Delta. That is to say, in the part between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and it's a really huge place. And why I went there? First of all, because I was invited as a professor there at the Louisiana State University. It was in 2017, and I went there with my two little kids, babies in fact, and my husband too, and I discovered a place, and I had tons of what we call in French idées reçues, like a priori, kind of ideas that are not the reality at all. So I thought at the very beginning, when I went there for the first time, that because of big climate hazards, the town planning will be really different than the one I know in France. And I thought also that town planning will be kind of innovative one regarding the fact that there is kind of ecological turn in this place. I was wrong, totally wrong. First of all, because of town planning in Europe and town planning in the US, it's not the same. And even more, town planning here in Chicago and town planning in the Mississippi Delta is not the same at all. And after 1 week or perhaps 1 month, I had the impression that there is no planner in the Mississippi Delta at all. And after Katrina, all the different courses and department of town planning have been closed. So that was really amazing. And I was afraid. I'm really afraid. And it was easy to be afraid in the Mississippi Delta. So it helped me to be afraid of our context in the French country, in fact. So it helped me to see what it is changing also in terms of town plannings, in terms of actors. So why I went back to Mississippi it was to better understand what it is going on in this transformation of the tools for the planners. That's why I was there, and the way I made that, or I investigate this question, was not to create a film. That was not my main idea. So I led a team of researchers there, and we met a lot of different communities facing the disappearance of their own land, because the land is disappearing in the sea because of the fact that sediments have not anymore the possibility to go on the different on the what's the name? I'm sorry, I forgot what's the river edge. So that's why the land mass of the Mississippi Delta is decreasing, and the people living there, mostly that they are not really aware of that. Yeah, it's a drama. So people, so the town planning, a big project can be to think about, is it a good place to live in this place? And this question is not really posed. And there is a lot of industrial factories there. And the projects, the town planning project, it's as the purpose to add some more land, so to create land. It's a land project that's just amazing. So with sediment diversions. And so it's not made by planners, it's not created with a discussion with community at all. So community can be Native American in this space for sure. And they are obviously the person that are the most impacted by this kind of ecological turn, but also by this kind of geoengineering projects. So that's why I was there, and that was also I'm here because it's connected. And perhaps here, in terms of town planning, there are tools, and you are planners, for example. So it gives me hope. But as you said, Ron, the big investments has been given to engineers. Sorry, I'm summarized, and I know I'm wrong, but you knew what I mean. So the biggest investment hasn't been given to the planners. So the change I have seen in the Mississippi Delta, where the private actors are really strong, and where there is no planner anymore. I'm summarizing. It's also occurring here, but not at the same scale.
I'm probably not the most qualified to speak on tribal or indigenous cultures in Chicago, but I would say that I was invited with my students 3 years ago by the DuSable Heritage Association, the Haitian community, and some in the indigenous tribes to help envision scenarios for DuSable Park at the confluence of the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. At least the constructed version of that, because the original one was much closer to Michigan Avenue. Of course, the founding family of Chicago, Jean-Baptiste DuSable, a French Haitian man, and Kitihawa, a Potawatomi woman, were the first family of Chicago, and their two children, a son and a daughter. I'm involved or been invited by the mayor to be part of the steering committee for DuSable Park. We'll see how it goes. Steering, I don't know what power one has in steering, but we're trying. One of the, which is, frankly, I call it our Statue of Liberty site. And, I think one of the discussions in this group has been, what do we do with Kitihawa when Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable has Lakeshore Drive? It has his name, it's not Kitihawa. So even in that balance, Kitihawa is emerging, I would say, in the city of Chicago as a stronger founder. We went from, Kinsey to DuSable. I think there's a movement to include Kitihawa in that, and that will change the history and the understanding of the city as also being a Potawatomi city, because through her, he was welcomed into the tribe. Pertaining to the rivers, especially, there's a group of us that we haven't worked really hard to pull this off yet, but it is an idea that has been discussed with some depth. And maybe I have two colleagues now who might be able to think about this as well. One of the students actually proposed that there be a tribal gathering in Chicago on the day that we celebrate DuSable, that we launch canoes full of people from all branches of the Chicago River, and they paddle down through the North Branch, the South Branch, the main branch, and when DuSable Park is done, that is a place of celebration. That could center the Potawatomi for sure in an annual ritual in the city. So it's not a space, it's not another condition, but what it is, it's a degree of centering them in the river. So I know there's an awareness, and there are actually designers trying to imagine ways of giving a stronger voice. So can we launch canoes on DuSable Day and have thousands of canoes coming down? It's actually kind of
interesting because some of the indigenous groups were actually some of the first people were well known for having a canoe program that gets people out on the water for the first time. But they actually started that in the 1960s because it's so important for their culture. So I think that's a really lovely idea. And I think the conversation, I'm also involved in that conversation around DuSable Park, and it's really interesting to hear the discussion about how do we represent all of this cultural history in a park. And I think it's going to be difficult to achieve, but I hope that it's something really great comes out of that. Yeah, I hope that something really, really excellent comes out of that project because it has a lot of potential. And there are other projects around Horner Park. There's a mound project in the works and other projects by those groups that are going on. There's a cultural trail that's being discussed and things. So there's lots of interesting things going on.
Is there another question? Or perhaps we can... Yes, there is one. Yeah.
Given the scale of the Chicago River, being small for such a mighty city, river is quite narrow, and its industrial heritage, at least in the past 200 years or so, and as it's cleaned up, more recreational use. Do you think there's a point coming where that industrial use, barge traffic, factories, whatever, on the river are going to be not viable anymore here in Chicago?
I think, I mean, you're starting to see for years transformation of some of the industrial areas, but there are a lot of uses in parts of the river that depend on that barge traffic, and especially people don't realize, but there's some major concrete facilities that need to be located in the center of the city because concrete has a shelf life, so you have to get it to the building and the highway very quickly. So there's uses like that that I think will be in the long term. But I think there's a lot of areas of the river right now, and that's when I was trying to talk about land use and the need for that future vision of what the next phase of transformation looks like and how that's economically viable and in a way that supports job growth as well as the ecology of the river. So that's what we would like. We would like to have that discussion and map that out instead of just kind of responding to the economy. I think it would be very beneficial to do some planning around that, being a planner.
Yeah, and that's as we've kind of been looking to other places where we can expand our work, especially, there's a bit of a tension, like Adam just very well described. A lot of times the assumption is that what is good for the climate it also deals with ecological concerns. And in this case, they might be a little bit at odds in that one of these barge loads of this material takes hundreds of diesel trucks off of the road in areas that are overburdened with this type of pollution and traffic in the first place. And so maybe it is a situation in which we always are going to have to allow some amount of industrial movement and some usage of this river system. I think the overwhelming thing is, we probably do exist in those spots right now that have to be there. What do you do with all this other space that's about to open up? And the big concern, I think, right now, planning-wise, is that this rest of the city is shedding all of its industrial character along the river, big areas that are redeveloping to become commercial and residential towers. But these overburdened, underserved communities on the South Branch that have always borne the brunt of this devastation are going to be continued to be locked out of the river system unless we do some creative things. So there's interesting opportunities. There's old barge slips that bypass about a half mile of industrial buffer where you have all these dirty, polluting industries still. These barge slips come right up to the communities and provide potential access points. A challenge that I think we have is that someone trying to redevelop there is still going to think of that as an industrial waterway, and we need to start pushing back and saying, well, we need access points for everyone because we can't be in a situation where the wealthy get all these benefits and the people who have always, been left holding the bag or continued to be, just forgotten about. So I think there's an interesting tension there. And the reality of an urban environment, it's better to live together in one place than to be spread out and create more suburbs, which are going to have even worse river impacts. So, we take good with bad and we just try to do the most efficient thing possible, I think, in a lot of cases.
Well, thank you. To maybe follow up on that, specifically on the South Branch and that access is I was actually just walking there the other day and looking at all the sheet piling and things like that. So that whole notion of like, how do we bring back not just access for people, but that riparian zone and the gradient, I think is really important in for humans as well as other species, right? Is the how we do that. And so much of that land is private land, and it is still a working river, right? And is there involvement by the new Amazon warehouse, like the kind of the data centers, the Damon silos, all this stuff. I mean, we can have the 78 can come in and do its beautification stuff, right? But there's still all those areas in the South Branch. Is there, is anyone working with industry to kind of find those little places to do something?
Oh yeah, that is our biggest goal, right? Is we can take the small bits that we're doing, the initial investments, and use that to demonstrate to these developers that there's a better path forward. And in a lot of cases, if you're not doing this, you're the one that's sticking out like a sore thumb. You're the one that is doing something that is the entire city is working for, and you're working against it. We have a great example right now where this investment that the city has put into the Wild Mile has encouraged our next door neighbor, which is, I mentioned our canal. 2/3 of that west side of that canal is owned by a large waste management facility. So it's a garbage transfer facility. Not a great spot to be, on the river. But them moving that facility means that a different area is then going to have to deal with a waste management transfer facility. So really can't be moved. We really needed to execute what we can do well in order to encourage them to do the right thing. And now they are, instead of what they could have done as they're worried about their shoreline falling in, they could have cut all the trees down that were there. They could have put up new armoring. This is kind of what they did at the Amtrak station on the South Branch. Missed an enormous opportunity, spent a lot of money to just put up seawall. The waste management's going to lean into what we do in the Wild Mile, and they're going to remove some of the invasive trees, add upland planting areas, and actually lay a stone berm and have this habitat continue into the river. So I think, like you're saying, those regrading and that kind of on-land portion is important, but coming into the water body itself is another piece, because a lot of situations you've got nice native prairie plants, and then you've got a hard armoring, a tow, and then you've got nothing going into the river. And so part of this too is we need to work with the Army Corps to have them pull their navigation channel off the side so that these developers can go into the water itself too, which is another really important piece of this. And I'm sure Adam can talk about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, all that's happening, which is great. And I would say the one thing is that, so the city's Chicago River Design Guidelines were updated in 2019, and the original guidelines that Friends worked on maybe 15 years before that were very basic. It was like you had to plant some trees and do a concrete trail. And now there's much more sophisticated requirements around landscape and riparian edges. And there's only been a few developments that have had to work through those new guidelines. And they are leading to much more innovative approaches like Phil is talking about. And we're excited to see there's one portion of the riverfront south of Harrison Street on the east side of the river called the South Bank. And what they did there is they cut the seawall down below the water level, actually, and then they naturally sloped up an edge and built an elevated boardwalk to allow for planting of trees and shrubbery underneath. And it's created this really lush and rich and interesting, diverse landscape that's totally different than the other parts of the kind of early 2000s Riverwalk you see by office buildings downtown. It's what we want. It's the future. It's how landscape should be treated along the river. And so that is, we use that as the standard now when we do a lot of advocacy. And so when we talk to developers, we're like, do more. There's examples of doing more, so please do more. And so people are starting to incorporate pieces of that cut down seawall, which can be combined with some of the floating stuff like you do and other strategies. And I think it's starting to change. So we're going to keep pushing for that kind of approach.
Okay, so is some
I just want to ask how we can incentivize like the salt shed and like the Sterling Bay. Like how are we going to incentivize and actually, because it's not like, oh wow, everyone else is doing it. It's like, right, so the people who are making that beautiful edge, like, that it's not really a given that everyone's like, I'm going to do that too. Because it's a really different motive. So part of me is like, there has to be a requirement that you're actually funding the climate concept fund. You actually have almost an endowment to deal with the risk and the pain, the financial pain that's coming to everyone except you. Like, you're profiting. I just feel like there's no oversight, and the alderman can just fight and be the squeaky wheel and get it through, but it's like, there's no, no. You can't move the riparian edge 30 feet and then have your dinner down there. No, someone has to be like, you have to pay this much to have your club on the river.
Yeah, I have.
Really?
I mean, I could talk about this for forever, but I think one thing that we also like to bring into the conversation is that when we do cost-benefit analysis related to development, it's a very narrow definition. And so what we like to talk about is that we should be considering all of the benefits, including ecological services, and all of the risks that you do from doing a non-environmental approach, because you're reducing resilience or you're causing flooding. What are all the monetary results of that, of doing the wrong thing? Right. And we do, so one thing that Phil participates in and I participate in is called the city's River Ecology and Governance Task Force. And so it's a much larger group. For years, it was really friends being the advocate, but now we have all these partners that result in a louder voice. And we're talking about things about how do you incentivize this? How do you make it much more stringent on the requirements? And there's things trickling through with the city. So right now they're updating the Sustainable Development Ordinance, which is a separate policy that applies to developments, and they're going to actually incentivize some of the river components of that. So that's, I do believe in incremental change, and some of these little policy changes do have a big effect. Like I talked about the new design guidelines, it completely changed the conversation. We used to, when I was a volunteer at Friends as a professional advisor, we used to have these ridiculous conversations with developers fighting for an extra tree. And now they see the value when they come to the table, and they know that it's going to be required. So they don't even start with that conversation. They start in a whole different place. So there is power to some of that work. So, yeah.
Hi, I have a question kind of for all of the panel, but I think you all kind of touched on the importance of kind of building these spaces for people to be able to get closer to the river and kind of appreciate that, and I think that's really important. So I was wondering, are you all considering any education initiatives for kids, elementary school through high school, even older, just younger professionals to kind of at a younger age grow up with and live with that deeper appreciation for nature? Because I think that'll kind of help solve problems in the future. If people grow up with that mindset now, they're thinking, I can't do these things because it's going to have this effect. So any education or community outreach initiatives?
Yeah, I'll mention ours, and I know Phil does a lot of this too, but Friends of the Chicago River has something called the Chicago River Schools Network, which both creates curriculum for teachers, but also takes youth on field trips. And we've had that for a long time, about 30 years, so we've served about 500,000 now. Public schools, CPS students, and other schools around the city, and it's a really great program. We get to take people out, and we take them out to the forest preserves and do water quality testing, and do macroinvertebrate surveys and different kinds of work. People kids who don't get to be out in nature in their everyday life. So it's a really excellent program, and I've been able to, that's not the kind of work that I get to do, but sometimes I get invited to participate, and that is definitely one of the most rewarding experiences. Just seeing the passion and excitement about kids about the environment these days is just pretty amazing. So that's a really fun thing to do.
If I may say something about the educational aspect, I would like to say that in terms of town planning, this question of the educational approach during decades was not really in the area of town planning. And now with the ecological perspective, I think is changing or is asked to change. So what we see, in fact, I will refer to an eco-psychologist, American one, Joanna Massey. I don't know if you know her. And she said that regarding the ecological term, there is 3 big actions that has been led at the same times. One is to create some eco-alternatives regarding to our common questions, so the river, so the question of ecological restoration is an eco-alternative. So the second step, or the second important issue, is to be able to fight against So normally, in terms of town planning, it's not in the area. But do we have the ability as inhabitants, even as academics, even as official planner, to fight against something we think that it's totally not the good solution? And the third, it's not really step, but the third aspect is what we can call the educational one, is the fact that because of this environmental term, we have to learn together, not only the kids, but professional to inhabitants, to look at our environment in a different way. And it's also hard work. And I think the three aspects are really important at the same level. So we have to work together in these three directions, and it's really impossible to do the three aspects in just one person, for sure. And but we are all working in the same direction, I think.
And I'll, some of the other stuff that we've been able to do, and part of it is it's situational. You know, I think it's really hard to educate someone and kind of bring them into what the majesty of the river ultimately is when their closest access to it is 20 feet up high on a bridge, and they don't really have any way to get close or feel different or be in a different environment. And being down on the river really changes that in a lot of ways. And so the access, I think, is critical. But also just it's a great opportunity. Like everyone, when they start thinking about the ways that they can contribute to this, they get excited for the same reasons. And it's learners of all ages, you know. So we've had one of our first educational programs was with the British International School, which is 2 blocks away. And if anyone's interested in rekindling a French and British rivalry about building wetlands, like we're able to do that. So they were able, and that's a school with tuition that's $50K per kid per year. It's an incredibly wealthy school. But they had the ability to give their students some of, I think, what is the coolest way of doing this, which we bought islands for them. We brought them up to their classroom. They planted them. And then we installed them in the river together. And then they are able to walk the 2 blocks. And year after year, as these kids have grown up, they're able to see the project grow up with them. And they're able to see their impact directly. And we have Brookfield Zoo had their summer camp come out. And that's, 12 to 14-year-olds. And they were able to explore the Wild Mile. They went home and they envisioned some kind of animal they wanted to see there, something they wanted to support. They designed little habitat, bat boxes, bird boxes, these kinds of things. And then they came out and installed them. And then they invited their parents and they gave little presentations about the things that they built and explained to their parents why they're important. And it's that kind of full thinking. I think we throw around the ideas of STEM, but the integration of these things and the problem solving, I think, is the most important, especially when we're talking about the context of these urban rivers. It is all problem solving, right? It's how do you do this while this is preventing you or limiting you in some way. So I think the quality of education that river-related stuff can provide is absolutely critical, especially in urban environments.
And I am an educator, right? I teach graduate landscape architects, so hopefully some of those students will come to the South Side to IIT to work with us, whereby our program was founded in 2006, so we're probably the youngest of the institutions. Our landscape architecture program was started in part because Chicago didn't have a landscape architecture program in the city. The primary sources for landscape architects in Chicago are from West Lafayette, Indiana, and Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, and Madison, Wisconsin, and other places. And our program was founded with the understanding that we needed to find a way that landscapes could be integrated into our urban environments. And that's kind of our mission. and we're quite active in both environmental and social justice around environmental issues, but in the design of public space. So we focus on public space. We're not looking at and streets. We're not looking at the Sterling Bay development sites. We're actually looking at the river, and we're looking at the streets. And so our educational mission really is to develop and train graduate students to look at these kinds of issues. And our students are from around the world and from 47th in Indiana. And so it's a really remarkable group that we're able to work with, looking at things like DuSable Park, or my colleague Nilay Mistry in the back standing up, brings our first year students out to Labaw Woods and other places, really almost to the headwaters of the Chicago River, is where a lot of these international students start to learn about what it is to be designing environmental and natural and social systems in one of the world's great cities.
It's time to have a drink. That's it. Yeah. Or it's your last question. No, I think it's time to discuss outside with a drink. No, there is a question.
Yeah, I do. I'll just do it. Like earlier in the conversation, Adam mentioned you're worried about the investment's going to be washed away because of the extreme weather we're facing now. Since the extreme weather going to be the new normal, and I was wondering, like for all the panelists, how that will change your strategy and planning and direction, even to approach to the old work you used to do. And even in academia, is there any research and planning into this type of work?
So some of our work has been specifically on how the floating components of what we're doing are fitting into this modern context. And so even just over July 4th weekend, there was so much rain that entered the area. We had these big sewer overflows. It was so much water that for the second time in a handful of years, they've had to reverse the river to go back out into the lake temporarily to move this water out of the place. So when we think about that, it's like, well, we imagine this stream to be a certain height, and it's not. What is the consequence of that? What do we have to repair every time we get these extreme events, and how do we take that top down? How do we reduce the extremes in the space that we've got, which is difficult, but it's one of the reasons that things being floating is helpful. You can't have the space horizontally, but if you use the space vertically very well, there are ways to get around. So we look at things like we have the freshwater mussel bunkers. So we have an ability to hold clean sand and clean substrate that these freshwater mussels burrow into that is going to ride out all these intense storms and the things that might cover them up and might pollute them. The gardens that we have, on a shoreline, they might get swept away by these powerful storms. They might get ripped up, or their roots might not be able to grab on like they're supposed to. But if everything's floating, you have a reservoir where these plants can then reproduce after these big storm events, and they can introduce that seed. It's about habitat connectivity and doing so in a way that reflects the reality. In other areas where you've got more space, you've got more tools that you can use. In the heart of the city where that shrinks down, you've got a lot less, and there's a lot harsher extremes that you have to deal with. But, we figured out how to put a city on top of a swamp and put it up on stilts, and we figured out and we're paying for it, and we figured out how to reverse the river going the way that didn't poison us, and we figured out all these incredible engineering feats. I'm so sure that we can figure out how to let nature do what it needs to do again. So it's challenging now because we don't know what the tools look like, but I think eventually, and given this time and these experiments in places like Chicago, we can start to figure that out.
I like that uplifting.
I think it's a perfect sentence for the end of this debate.
Thank you very much.